That night, heavy rain poured over Lagos. The streets were wet and crowded, as cars rushed through the darkness and people hurried home beneath their umbrellas. But across the road from a small bakery called Ada's Kitchen, a black luxury SUV remained parked quietly in the rain. It had been there for almost an hour. Inside sat Daniel Adebayo, a billionaire businessman who could afford almost anything money could buy. But Daniel wasn't thinking about business that night. He wasn't thinking about his companies, his properties, or his millions. His attention was fixed on the little bakery across the street, or rather, on the woman inside it. Her name was Ada, and she had no idea that the man watching her from across the road was about to change both of their lives forever. Daniel had met many beautiful women in his life, women who already knew his name before he even introduced himself. Some admired his success. Others became unusually friendly the moment they discovered just how wealthy he was. After a while, Daniel stopped knowing who genuinely liked him and who simply liked the life his money could provide. But there was something different about Ada. Night after night, as she prepared to close her little bakery, Daniel noticed the small things she did when she believed nobody was watching. She treated her workers with kindness. She greeted strangers with the same warmth she gave paying customers. And somehow, she always seemed to notice people everyone else ignored. Daniel wasn't fascinated by Ada because she was beautiful. He was fascinated by the kind of person she seemed to be when there was absolutely nothing to gain. And on this rainy night, Ada was about to do something that would make Daniel see her in a completely different way. As Ada prepared to close the bakery, she noticed an elderly woman sitting alone in the rain. The woman's old umbrella was broken, and she was trembling from the cold. Ada stopped. She looked at the bread she hadn't sold that day, then back at the woman. Without hesitation, she packed the leftover bread into 2 bags and hurried outside. But Ada didn't stop there. When she noticed how badly the woman was shivering, she slowly removed her own jacket and gently placed it around the woman's shoulders. Within seconds, the rain began soaking Ada's clothes. But she didn't seem to care. She placed the bags of bread into the woman's hands and smiled. "Please, Mama, take these home. At least you won't go to bed hungry tonight." The elderly woman's eyes filled with gratitude. And across the street, Daniel sat completely still inside his SUV, watching through the rain-covered window. Ada thought nobody important had seen what she did. She was wrong. Daniel remained silent inside the SUV, unable to take his eyes off Ada. All his life, he had been surrounded by luxury. He had eaten at expensive restaurants, where a single meal could cost more than some families earned in a month. He had attended glamorous parties, met beautiful women dressed in diamonds, and lived in a world where almost everything had a price. But somehow, none of those things had ever touched him the way this simple moment did. Ada hadn't helped the elderly woman because anyone was watching. She wasn't looking for praise. She didn't even know Daniel was there. She had simply seen someone in need and chose to help. For the first time in a very long time, Daniel wasn't captivated by a woman's beauty. He was captivated by her heart. A small smile appeared on his face as he continued watching her through the rain. Daniel didn't know it yet, but somewhere in that quiet moment, he had already begun falling in love with Ada. A few weeks later, Daniel attended an exclusive charity event in Victoria Island, Lagos. The hall was filled with wealthy businessmen, celebrities, and some of the city's most influential people. But the moment Daniel walked through the doors, the atmosphere changed. Heads turned. People whispered his name. Businessmen immediately wanted a few minutes of his time, while others searched for an opportunity to introduce themselves. That was normal for Daniel. After all, Daniel Adebayo was one of the most successful young businessmen in Lagos. But none of the attention interested him. He had experienced it too many times before. Then suddenly, above the music and conversations, Daniel heard a woman's angry voice coming from the catering area. He turned toward the sound, and for a moment, everything else in the room seemed to disappear. Because standing beside the catering tables was Ada. Near the catering area, Ada stood staring at several trays of perfectly untouched food. Then she noticed the event organizer preparing to throw them away. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What do you mean you're throwing all this food away?" The organizer barely looked concerned. "The event is over. We don't need it anymore." Ada couldn't believe what she was hearing. She pointed toward the entrance. "There are people outside who haven't eaten today. Package the food and give it to them." Her voice was loud enough to attract attention. Several wealthy guests turned to stare, but Ada didn't care. She wasn't trying to behave like the most sophisticated woman in the room, and she certainly wasn't trying to impress anyone. She simply couldn't understand how perfectly good food could be thrown away, while someone outside might go to bed hungry. A few meters away, Daniel watched the entire argument, and slowly, a smile appeared on his face. It was her again, the same woman with the same compassionate heart, even when she had no idea Daniel was watching. The hall was filled with beautiful women, women dressed in expensive gowns, surrounded by wealth, glamour, and attention. Yet Daniel barely noticed any of them. His eyes remained fixed on one woman, Ada, the woman standing beside the catering table, arguing passionately over food that wasn't even hers. Daniel recognized her immediately. She was the woman from the little bakery, the same woman he had watched step into the pouring rain to help an elderly stranger. And now, here she was again, showing the same kindness when she had absolutely nothing to gain from it. Daniel couldn't help but smile. Almost everyone in that hall knew who he was. Some wanted his attention, others wanted his connections. But Ada? She didn't even know Daniel was standing there. And perhaps, that was exactly what made him want to know her. Daniel placed his drink down and slowly began walking toward her. Daniel finally walked over to Ada. For a moment, he simply stood beside her before offering a warm smile. "Hi, I'm Daniel." Ada looked at him and smiled back. Ada, and that was it. No excitement, no nervous reaction, no sudden change in the way she spoke to him. To Ada, he was simply Daniel, a man she had just met at a charity event. They began talking, and surprisingly, the conversation felt easy. At one point, Ada looked at his serious expression and laughed. "Do you always look this serious? Or is it just for special occasions?" Daniel couldn't help himself. He laughed, a real, genuine laugh. Within a few minutes, Daniel realized he was enjoying Ada's company more than he had enjoyed the entire event. For once, a woman was talking to Daniel the man, not Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire. And he wished the moment could remain that simple. Unfortunately, someone was about to reveal exactly who he was. Daniel and Ada were still talking and laughing when a photographer suddenly approached them. The man smiled excitedly. "Mr. Adebayo, sir, may I get a photograph?" Ada's smile disappeared. She slowly turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Adebayo." Before Daniel could explain, the photographer looked at Ada in surprise. "You don't know Daniel Adebayo, the owner of Adebayo Holdings?" Ada froze. Just moments earlier, she had been relaxed, laughing and teasing Daniel like they were two ordinary people. But now, everything changed. Her expression became guarded. Her shoulders stiffened. She looked Daniel up and down as though she was suddenly seeing a completely different man. "You're that Daniel Adebayo?" Daniel slowly nodded. "Yes." Ada took one small step backward, and Daniel noticed it immediately. It was only one step, but it told him more than words ever could. This wasn't excitement. It wasn't admiration. There was something almost like fear in Ada's eyes. And as Daniel watched the warmth disappear from her face, one question entered his mind. What had a wealthy man done to Ada to make her react like this? That night, long after the charity event had ended, Daniel still couldn't get Ada out of his mind. But this time, it wasn't her smile he was thinking about. It was the way that smile had disappeared the moment she discovered he was wealthy. Daniel knew there had to be a reason. So he called the one person he trusted more than anyone else. His longtime friend and business manager, Toby. "Toby, I need you to find out something about Ada." Toby looked at him carefully. "What exactly do you want to know?" Daniel hesitated. Then he said quietly, "I want to know what happened to her." It took some time, but eventually, Toby discovered the truth. And what he found explained everything. Ada hadn't always been afraid of trusting wealthy men. In fact, there was once a time when she had loved one enough to agree to spend the rest of her life with him. His name was Kelvin. He was handsome, successful, and extremely wealthy. Ada believed she had found the man she would marry. But during the most painful period of her life, Kelvin showed her exactly what kind of man he really was. And what happened next changed Ada forever. Years earlier, Ada's life had been very different. She still had her father, the man who had raised her, encouraged her dreams, and supported her through every difficult moment. But then, her father became seriously ill. Suddenly, Ada's days were no longer about wedding plans or building a future with Kelvin. They were spent inside hospital corridors, waiting for doctors, paying medical bills, and praying desperately that her father would recover. Ada needed Kelvin more than ever. She needed the man she planned to marry to simply stand beside her. But instead, Kelvin became impatient. He complained that Ada no longer had enough time for him. He reminded her of the expensive lifestyle he was providing, the restaurants, the gifts, and the future he had promised her. To Kelvin, Ada's father's illness had become an inconvenience. And while Ada was fighting desperately not to lose one of the most important people in her life, the man who claimed to love her made everything about himself. Still, Ada tried to hold the relationship together. She kept hoping Kelvin would understand, that eventually, he would show her the love and support she desperately needed. But then came one terrible afternoon, when Ada received the news she had been praying never to hear. And on that day, she needed Kelvin more than she had ever needed him before. That afternoon, Ada's worst fear became reality. After days of praying, hoping, and waiting for good news, her father died. For a long time, Ada sat alone on a bench in the hospital corridor. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even understand how the man who had always been there for her was suddenly gone. In her arms were the few personal belongings the nurses had returned to her. Ada held them tightly against her chest, as tears rolled silently down her face. Her entire world had just fallen apart. Kelvin stood only a few feet away. This was the moment Ada needed him most. She needed him to sit beside her, to hold her, to tell her she didn't have to face the pain alone. But Kelvin did none of those things. Instead, he looked impatiently at his watch. Then he reminded Ada that they were already late for an important dinner. For a moment, Ada thought she had heard him wrongly. Her father had just died, and the man she was supposed to marry was worried about a dinner. Slowly, Ada lifted her tear-filled eyes and looked at Kelvin. She didn't argue. She didn't shout. She simply stared at him, because in that painful moment, Ada finally saw the man she was about to marry for who he truly was. And something inside her changed forever. A few minutes later, Ada walked out of the hospital with Kelvin following behind her. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Her heart was broken. But suddenly, Ada stopped. She looked down at the engagement ring on her finger, the ring that once represented the future she believed she would have with Kelvin. Slowly, Ada removed it. Kelvin stared at her in confusion. "Ada, what are you doing?" She didn't answer immediately. She simply took his hand and placed the ring into his palm. "My father just died, Kelvin." Kelvin tried to explain himself, but Ada shook her head. There was nothing left to explain. Then, with tears still running down her face, she looked directly into his eyes. "If this is how you love me when I'm broken, then I don't want your love when I'm whole." Kelvin stood there speechless. Ada turned around and walked away. She walked away from Kelvin. She walked away from his money. And she walked away from the comfortable future they had once planned together. It hurt, but Ada knew staying with the wrong person would hurt even more. And from that day forward, she made herself a promise. Money would never again convince her that a man had a good heart, because Ada had learned something the hardest way possible. A wealthy man could give you everything money could buy, and still fail to give you the one thing you needed most: genuine love. After Toby finished telling him everything, Daniel said nothing. He slowly walked toward the huge window in his office and stared out at the Lego skyline. From where he stood, he could see a world most people could only dream about. Buildings he owned, businesses he controlled, cars waiting downstairs, a beautiful home, and more money than he could possibly spend. For years, Daniel had believed those things made his life complete. But after hearing Ada's story, he looked at his wealth differently. Ada didn't hate rich men because they had money. She was afraid of what money sometimes revealed in people. And Daniel knew that if he approached her as Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, she might never allow herself to discover the man behind the name. He stood silently for a moment. Then, a strange idea entered his mind. What if Ada could meet Daniel the man before she met Daniel's money? What if, for once, he could live without the expensive suits, the luxury cars, the powerful surname, and everything that made people treat him differently? Could Ada love him if she believed he had nothing? Daniel turned away from the window. His mind was made up. He was going to find out. But there was one thing Daniel didn't understand yet. The moment you use a lie to search for true love, you risk destroying the very love you're trying to find. The following morning, Daniel called Toby into his office. He placed a property file on the desk and looked at his friend seriously. "I have a plan." Toby immediately became suspicious. Whenever Daniel said those words, Something complicated usually followed. Daniel opened the file. The commercial complex where Ada's bakery was located actually belonged to one of Daniel's companies. But Ada had no idea. Daniel pointed at the property. For the next few weeks, I'm going to work there. Toby nodded slowly. Okay. Doing what? Daniel looked directly at him. As a security guard. Toby froze. For several seconds. He simply stared at Daniel. Then he leaned forward. You want to do? What? Daniel remained completely serious. I'll disappear from my normal life during the day. No expensive suits. No luxury cars. Nobody at the complex can know who I really am. Toby couldn't believe what he was hearing. You own companies, Daniel. You have hundreds of employees. And now you want to stand at a gate opening doors for people. Daniel smiled slightly. I want Ada to know me without the money. Toby shook his head. He had known Daniel for years. But this was easily the craziest thing his friend had ever suggested. Finally, Toby sighed. This is either love or complete madness. Daniel picked up the property file and smiled. Maybe both. Neither man knew it yet. But Daniel's little experiment was about to change his life forever. The following morning, Daniel Adebayo left his billionaire lifestyle behind. For the first time in years, there was no chauffeur waiting to open his door. No expensive designer suit. No luxury wristwatch. And definitely no flashy car. Instead, Daniel arrived at the commercial complex in an ordinary vehicle, wearing simple trousers, a basic shirt, and shoes that cost less than what he normally spent on dinner. Even Toby had laughed when he saw him that morning. But Daniel was completely serious. Waiting beside the security post was Mr. Bello, the head of security. And the moment Mr. Bello saw Daniel approaching, the poor man became nervous. After all, Daniel wasn't just another new employee. He was the billionaire whose company secretly owned the entire complex. And somehow, Mr. Bello was now expected to treat his own boss. Like an ordinary security guard, Daniel walked up to him and extended his hand. Good morning, Mr. Bello. Mr. Bello quickly straightened himself. Good morning, sir. Daniel smiled and shook his head. No, Mr. Bello. From today, I'm just Daniel. Mr. Bello swallowed nervously. Yes, sir. Daniel frowned. No, sir. Mr. Bello looked around awkwardly. Then tried again. Yes, Daniel. Daniel smiled. Better. Mr. Bello forced a nervous smile. But inside, he was probably wondering how he had ended up supervising his own billionaire employer. And Daniel? He was about to discover that pretending to be an ordinary security guard was much easier in his imagination than it would be in real life. Inside the small security office, Mr. Bello picked up a neatly folded navy blue uniform and slowly handed it to Daniel. For a few seconds, Daniel simply stared at it. It felt almost unbelievable. This was a man who owned beautiful houses, ran successful companies, and had luxury cars sitting unused in his garage. Yet for the next few weeks, Daniel would spend his days standing at a security gate, opening and closing gates for strangers, directing cars under the hot Lagos sun, and taking instructions from people who had absolutely no idea that the security guard standing in front of them was actually a billionaire. Daniel remembered Tun's warning. This could go terribly wrong. And deep inside, Daniel knew his friend was probably right. But then he thought about Ada. He remembered her kindness to the elderly woman in the rain. He remembered the way she fought to save leftover food at the charity event. And most importantly, he remembered how quickly she had pulled away when she discovered he was wealthy. Daniel finally reached out and took the uniform from Mr. Bello. There was only one thing he wanted to discover. Who was Ada when money wasn't standing between them? And perhaps even more importantly, would she ever be able to love Daniel if she believed he had nothing? A few minutes later, Daniel stepped out wearing the navy blue security uniform for the first time. He walked toward the small mirror inside the changing room and stopped. For several seconds, he simply stared at his reflection. The billionaire businessman everyone recognized was gone. No expensive suit, no designer shoes, no luxury watch, no powerful executive surrounded by assistants and bodyguards. Standing in that mirror was simply Daniel, a man in an ordinary security uniform. He slowly adjusted his collar and continued staring at himself. All his life, Daniel had wondered whether people truly cared about the man behind his wealth, or whether they only cared about the name Adebayo and everything that came with it. His money had always entered the room before people had the chance to know his heart. But this time, things would be different. Ada wouldn't see the billionaire. She wouldn't see the successful businessman. She would see an ordinary man trying to earn a living. Daniel took one final look at himself in the mirror, then quietly walked toward the door. For the first time in his life, he was about to discover what it felt like to have nothing but himself to offer. And somewhere outside that door, Ada was about to meet the new Daniel. The next morning began like any other day for Ada. She arrived at the commercial complex carrying her handbag and a few supplies for the bakery. As usual, she greeted the cleaners with a smile. "Good morning." She waved at Mr. Bello, then continued toward her bakery without thinking twice about the new security guard standing beside the gate. She walked past him. One step, two steps. Then suddenly, Ada stopped. Something didn't feel right. She slowly turned her head toward the security post. The new guard looked strangely familiar. Ada narrowed her eyes. She took a few steps backward, trying to get a better look at his face. Then, the security guard turned around. Ada froze. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The man standing there in a navy blue security uniform was the same wealthy businessman she had met at the charity event, Daniel Adebayo. Ada looked at the uniform, then at Daniel's face, then back at the uniform again. She almost dropped everything she was carrying, because only one question was running through her mind. What on earth was a billionaire doing? Working as a security guard? Ada stood completely still. Then finally, Daniel. Daniel turned toward her and gave what was probably the most uncomfortable smile of his life. "Good morning, Ada." Ada didn't respond. She simply stared at him, first at his face, then at the navy blue security uniform, then back at his face again. For several seconds, Ada couldn't find the words. This was Daniel Adebayo, the wealthy businessman she had met at that glamorous charity event. The man whose name alone had been enough to make photographers rush toward him. Yet now, he was standing beside a security post, wearing a uniform and preparing to spend the day opening gates and directing cars. Ada slowly stepped closer. "Wait." She looked at the uniform one more time. "Daniel, what happened?" Daniel swallowed. He knew this moment was coming. He had practiced his explanation. He had prepared exactly what he was going to say. But standing there, looking directly into Ada's confused eyes, the lie suddenly didn't feel so easy anymore. And then Ada folded her arms and asked the question Daniel had been waiting for. "So, what happened to Mr. Billionaire?" Ada folded her arms. "So, what happened to Mr. Billionaire?" Daniel had rehearsed the lie several times. But suddenly, looking into Ada's eyes, it felt much harder to say. He told her his family's business had collapsed, that debts had swallowed almost everything, that friends disappeared when the money disappeared. Ada studied him quietly. Daniel prepared himself for pity, or perhaps even satisfaction. Instead, Ada did something he hadn't expected. Warm, sincere, and emotional. Let Ada's kindness feel natural rather than dramatic. Slow down when Daniel realizes she is treating him differently. Ada's expression slowly softened. For a moment, she simply looked at Daniel. Then she said quietly, "I'm sorry, Daniel." Daniel wasn't expecting that. There was no laughter, no mockery, and surprisingly, there was no pity either. Ada looked directly into his eyes. "Losing your money doesn't make you less of a person." Daniel remained silent. Ada continued, "At least you're here working. You're trying to rebuild your life, instead of sitting somewhere feeling sorry for yourself." Those simple words hit Daniel harder than she could possibly understand. This was the same woman who had immediately become guarded when she discovered he was a billionaire. Yet now, when she believed the money was gone, she was treating him with more warmth than ever before. Daniel stared at her, almost speechless. All his life, he had wondered what would happen if the money disappeared. Would people still respect him? Would anyone still see value in the man underneath all that wealth? Standing in front of him, Ada had just given him an answer. And as she smiled and walked toward her bakery, Daniel watched her go. His little plan was working. But suddenly, that didn't feel like such a good thing. Because Daniel no longer wanted Ada simply to trust him. He wanted her to like him. Not the billionaire. Not the owner of Adebayo Holdings. Just Daniel. And without realizing it, the game he had started was slowly becoming real. By midday, Daniel discovered something nobody had warned him about. Being a security guard was hard. Very hard. The Lagos sun seemed to have a personal problem with him. The heat beat down relentlessly as Daniel stood beside the gate, already sweating through his uniform. And there was no break. One car entered. Another one followed. Security. Open the gate. Another driver started honking before Daniel could even move. Beep, beep. Security. Hurry up. Daniel took a deep breath and continued working. Normally, at this time of the day, he would be sitting comfortably inside his air-conditioned office, with cold water on his desk and assistants handling almost everything around him. But today, there was no executive chair, no air conditioner, no assistant, just Daniel, the burning Legos son, and impatient drivers who seemed to believe their car horns could make him move faster. At first, Daniel almost found it funny. But as the hours passed, something began to change inside him. People drove past without greeting him. Some gave orders without even looking at his face. Others spoke to him as though the uniform made him less important. And slowly, Daniel began to understand something. His wealth had protected him from his entire life. There were hardworking people all around him. People he had probably walked past hundreds of times without truly noticing. For the first time, Daniel understood what it felt like to be seen by everyone, yet treated as though you were invisible. Asterisk, asterisk. Then came a moment Daniel would never forget. A luxury car pulled into the complex. The owner stepped out, a wealthy businessman dressed in expensive clothes. Without even greeting Daniel, the man casually tossed his car key toward him. Security, park it. Daniel caught the key. For a moment, he simply stood there. No, please. No, thank you. The man didn't even bother to look Daniel properly in the face. He simply turned around and walked away, as though Daniel wasn't a person, as though he was just part of the uniform. Daniel's jaw tightened. Every instinct inside him wanted to call the man back. He wanted to say, "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" One phone call from Daniel could reveal exactly who he was. But he stopped himself. He looked down at the car key in his hand, and suddenly, his anger became something else. Understanding. That businessman wasn't disrespecting Daniel Adebayo. He didn't know Daniel Adebayo was standing there. He was disrespecting a security guard because he believed a security guard wasn't important enough to deserve basic respect. And for the first time, Daniel wondered about his own life. How many security guards had opened gates for him? How many cleaners had walked past him? How many drivers, waiters, and ordinary workers had served him without Daniel ever stopping to ask their names? He looked at the key again. That day, Daniel learned something money had never taught him. Sometimes, you don't truly know how people treat those beneath them until they believe you're one of them. Asterisk, asterisk. By late afternoon, Daniel was completely exhausted. His feet hurt from standing for hours. His stomach was empty, and his security uniform was already damp with sweat. The billionaire who normally spent his afternoons inside a cool, air-conditioned office could barely keep his eyes open. Daniel finally dragged himself toward the security post and dropped heavily onto the small plastic chair. For a man who could afford almost anything money could buy, he had never appreciated something as simple as a chair in the shade. Daniel leaned back and closed his eyes. For just a moment, he wanted to forget about the cars, the impatient drivers, and the burning Legos sun. Then, he heard footsteps approaching. A familiar voice called softly, "Daniel." His eyes slowly opened, and standing directly in front of him was Ada, but she wasn't empty-handed. Daniel looked up at Ada and noticed what she was holding. In one hand was a cold bottle of water. In the other, a freshly baked meat pie. Ada stretched them toward him. Daniel looked at the food, then back at her. "For me?" Ada laughed. "No, they're for the invisible man sitting beside you." Daniel couldn't help but smile. He reached out and accepted them. "Thank you, Ada." She shrugged casually. "You look like you were about to faint. I can't have the new security guard collapsing in front of my bakery." Daniel laughed, but as he opened the bottle of water, he found himself looking at Ada differently. She had no idea who was really sitting in front of her. She didn't know that Daniel could walk into the most expensive restaurant in Lagos and order anything he wanted. She didn't know that he could probably buy every meat pie in her bakery without thinking twice. To Ada, he was simply a tired security guard who hadn't eaten, and that was enough reason for her to care. Daniel looked down at the simple meat pie in his hand. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't luxurious. But somehow, because Ada had noticed he was hungry and brought it to him herself, it meant more to Daniel than some of the most expensive meals he had ever eaten. And without either of them realizing it, something small was beginning to grow between them. Daniel sat beside the security post, slowly eating the meat pie Ada had brought him. But Ada didn't leave. She stayed beside him. And somehow, An ordinary conversation turned into one of the best parts of Daniel's day. They talked about difficult customers. They complained about Lego's traffic. Then Ada looked toward the gate and started laughing. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What? Ada shook her head. For someone who claims he's getting used to this job, you're still terrible at directing cars. Daniel laughed. I'm improving. Ada smiled. That's what you said yesterday. They both laughed. And for those few minutes, Daniel forgot who he really was. He forgot about the board meetings waiting for him, the investors calling his phone, the companies depending on his decisions, and the billionaire life he would secretly return to later that night. None of it mattered. There was only Ada, a plastic chair, a cold bottle of water, and a simple meat pie. Daniel looked at her as she continued talking and realized something strange. He had spent years searching for happiness in bigger houses, faster cars, more successful businesses, and more money. Yet somehow, one of the happiest moments of his life was happening beside a small security post with a woman who believed he had lost everything. And for the first time, Daniel began to wonder. Maybe the richest moments in life had nothing to do with money at all. As the days passed, Daniel and Ada began spending more time together. Sometimes, even after the bakery had closed for the night, Daniel would find another excuse to stay. He helped Ada carry heavy bags of flour into the store. He moved boxes, fixed loose shelves, and whenever Ada needed an extra pair of hands, Daniel somehow always seemed to be nearby. One evening, Ada watched him struggle with a heavy bag of flour and started laughing. For somebody who used to be a billionaire, you're surprisingly useful. Daniel dropped the bag onto the counter and pretended to look offended. Used to be, Ada smiled. Fine, former rich man. Daniel laughed. You'd be amazed what desperation can teach a man. Ada shook her head, still smiling. Those little moments soon became normal. After closing, when the customers were gone and the bakery became quiet, they would talk. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they worked without saying much at all. And slowly, without Ada even realizing it, the wall she had built around her heart began coming down. She stopped seeing Daniel as the wealthy businessman she had met at the charity event. She stopped seeing him as the unfortunate man who had supposedly lost everything. Instead, she simply began seeing Daniel, a man who listened to her, a man who made her laugh, a man who stayed when he didn't have to. And the more time Ada spent with him, the safer her heart began to feel around him. Unfortunately, the man she was beginning to trust was still hiding the biggest truth of all. One quiet evening after the bakery had closed, Ada and Daniel sat together in the empty shop. For once, there were no jokes, no customers, no work left to distract them. Ada became unusually quiet. Then, after a long pause, she finally began telling Daniel about the part of her life she rarely spoke about. She told him about her father, about the illness that kept them inside hospital corridors for days, about the afternoon she lost him, and how helpless she had felt holding his belongings after he was gone. Then she told Daniel about Kelvin, the man she had once planned to marry. Her voice trembled as she remembered how Kelvin had treated her during the most painful moment of her life. Finally, Ada looked down at her hands. I wasn't angry because Kelvin had money, Daniel. She paused. I was angry because he believed his money could excuse everything. Daniel's expression changed. Ada continued quietly. He thought buying me things meant he didn't have to be there when I needed him. And when my father died, I realized I would rather have a man with nothing who genuinely cared about me than a rich man who made me feel alone. Those words hit Daniel harder than Ada could possibly know. For a moment, guilt filled his eyes. But he didn't interrupt her. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to explain away her pain. He simply sat there and listened. And to Ada, that meant everything. Because sometimes, when someone has carried pain for too long, they aren't looking for someone to fix them. They simply need someone willing to sit beside them, hear their story, and stay. That night, Ada felt something she hadn't felt with a man in a very long time. Safe. But Daniel knew the painful truth. The more Ada trusted him, the more his secret had the power to break her heart. After listening quietly to Ada's story, Daniel realized that, for once, he wanted to tell her something about himself. Something real. He looked down for a moment before speaking. I grew up in a very big house. Ada looked at him with surprise. Daniel gave a small, sad smile. But somehow, it never really felt like home. Ada said nothing. She simply allowed him to continue. And this time, Daniel wasn't lying. His parents had given him almost everything money could provide. the best schools, expensive clothes, beautiful holidays, a huge house filled with everything a child could possibly want. Everything, except their time. Daniel grew up surrounded by housekeepers, drivers, and security guards. There were always people around him. Yet somehow he was always lonely. He remembered eating dinner at a huge table with empty chairs around him. He remembered birthdays when expensive gifts arrived. But the people he desperately wanted beside him were too busy to come. As Daniel grew older, the house became bigger. The money became greater. The number of people around him increased. But that feeling of loneliness never completely disappeared. Daniel looked at Ada. I think that's why I stopped believing that having everything means you're happy. Ada's expression softened. For the first time, she wasn't looking at Daniel with sympathy. Because she believed he had lost his fortune, she was beginning to understand the lonely man underneath it all. And strangely, for Daniel, this moment felt different. He was still hiding his identity. He was still hiding his wealth. But the loneliness he had just shared with Ada was completely real. And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel felt like someone wasn't simply looking at him. She was actually seeing him. For a moment, neither Ada nor Daniel said anything. The bakery had become completely quiet. Outside, Lagos was still alive. Cars moved through the streets. People hurried home. And somewhere in the distance, horns echoed through the night. But inside that little bakery, everything seemed to slow down. Ada looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked back at her. Neither of them needed to speak. There were no expensive gifts on the table, no flowers, no romantic promises, no dramatic declaration of love. They didn't even touch. They simply sat there. Two people who had spent years feeling lonely in completely different worlds, finally feeling understood by someone. Ada gave him a small smile. Daniel smiled back. And somehow, that quiet moment meant more than either of them was ready to admit. For Ada, something important was happening. The fear Kelvin had left behind was slowly disappearing. She was beginning to trust a man again. And that man was Daniel. But while Ada's heart was slowly opening, Daniel's was becoming heavier. Because every time she smiled at him, every time she trusted him with another piece of her heart, he remembered the truth. Ada wasn't falling for Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire. She was falling for the security guard she believed he had become. And Daniel knew that eventually, he would have to tell her everything. For the first time since beginning his plan, Daniel wasn't afraid that Ada might reject him because he was wealthy. He was afraid of something much worse. That when Ada discovered the truth, she would never trust him again. One evening after closing, Ada walked toward her old car, ready to head home. She climbed inside, turned the key, and nothing happened. She tried again. Still nothing. Ada sighed, stepped out of the car, and opened the bonnet. Then she stood there, staring seriously at the engine as though looking at it long enough might somehow convince the car to start. A few moments later, Daniel noticed her. He walked over. Problem. Ada looked at him and sighed. My car has finally decided it hates me. Daniel laughed. Move. Let me see. Ada stepped aside. Daniel rolled up his sleeves and leaned over the engine with the confidence of a professional mechanic. He checked one thing, then another. 5 minutes passed. Ada watched him carefully. Finally, she folded her arms. Daniel, do you actually know what you're doing? Daniel slowly straightened himself. He looked at the engine, then at Ada, and with complete confidence, he replied, No. Ada stared at him for 1 second, then burst out laughing. Daniel started laughing too. Unfortunately, the car still refused to start, which left them with only one option: public transport. Ada didn't seem bothered at all. Daniel, however, looked toward the busy Lagos road and suddenly realized there was one small problem. With pretending to be broke, he couldn't exactly call his chauffeur. And as Ada happily led him toward the bus stop, Daniel quietly followed behind her. He had survived difficult business negotiations, hostile investors, and deals worth millions. But somehow, the thought of entering a crowded Lagos bus terrified him more than all of them combined. Daniel Adebayo had traveled around the world in private jets. He had been driven through Lagos in luxury cars. And whenever he traveled commercially, first class was the only part of the plane he knew. But nothing, absolutely nothing, in Daniel's billionaire life had prepared him for a crowded Lagos bus. The moment they entered, a voice shouted, Move inside. There's space. Daniel looked around in confusion. Space. He couldn't see any space. But somehow, Ada squeezed through the passengers as though she had done it 1,000 times. Daniel had no choice but to follow. One passenger moved left, another moved right, and within seconds, Daniel found himself trapped between complete strangers, holding tightly onto the rail as the bus moved through Lagos traffic. Ada took one look at his uncomfortable face and immediately started laughing. "Mr. Former Billionaire, are you okay?" Daniel gave her a serious look. "Ada, I can't feel my left arm." That only made her laugh harder. Daniel tightened his grip on the rail as the bus suddenly changed direction. Then he looked around at the other passengers. Wait, people voluntarily do this every day? Ada could barely control her laughter. "Welcome to Lagos, Daniel." Daniel shook his head. He had walked into boardrooms filled with powerful businessmen without feeling nervous. Yet inside this crowded bus, he was holding onto that rail like his entire life depended on it. Ada continued laughing at him, and although Daniel would never admit it, he was beginning to enjoy himself too. Unfortunately for him, the bus hadn't finished embarrassing Mr. Former Billionaire just yet. Just when Daniel thought he was finally getting used to the bus, the driver suddenly moved forward. The bus moved. The passengers moved. But Daniel? Daniel was not ready. His entire body flew forward. He desperately grabbed the nearest thing he could find and nearly landed on another passenger. Sorry. Daniel quickly struggled back to his feet. Ada saw everything, and that was it. She completely lost control. She laughed so hard she had to hold onto the rail. Daniel looked at her, embarrassed. "Ada, this isn't funny." Ada tried to stop laughing. She really tried, but the expression on Daniel's face made it impossible. "I'm sorry," she said between laughs. "You should have seen yourself." Daniel stared at her. "You're enjoying this far too much." That only made Ada laugh even harder. A few passengers nearby began smiling too. Daniel shook his head, but eventually, even he couldn't keep a straight face. A smile appeared. Then he started laughing with her. And suddenly, Daniel didn't care anymore. He didn't care that strangers had just watched him nearly fall. He didn't care that Ada was laughing at him. He didn't care whether he looked wealthy, powerful, important, or completely ridiculous. For perhaps the first time in his carefully controlled life, Daniel wasn't trying to protect an image. He was simply enjoying the moment. And as he watched Ada laughing beside him, Daniel realized something. He had spent years surrounded by luxury, but he couldn't remember the last time he had felt this free. Asterisk asterisk. After surviving the crowded bus ride, Ada and Daniel continued walking along the busy Lagos roadside. A few minutes later, Ada suddenly stopped. The smell of freshly roasted corn filled the air. She smiled and walked toward a roadside vendor. Daniel followed. Ada bought one roasted corn, then carefully broke it into two. She stretched one half toward Daniel. Daniel looked at the corn, then at Ada, then back at the corn. Ada raised an eyebrow. "What?" Daniel smiled. "Nothing." Ada laughed. "Don't tell me billionaires don't eat roasted corn." Daniel quickly corrected her. "Former billionaire." Ada nodded seriously. "Exactly. So stop behaving expensive and eat." Daniel laughed and accepted it. He took his first bite, and Ada watched him expectantly. "Well," Daniel nodded. "Not bad." Ada frowned playfully. "Not bad. Give it back." Daniel quickly moved the corn away from her. No, I didn't say it was bad." Ada burst out laughing. And once again, Daniel found himself enjoying something incredibly simple. No expensive restaurant. No private dining room. No waiter standing nearby. Just a Lagos roadside. Roasted corn. And Ada beside him. Daniel looked at her as they continued eating. She had no idea how wealthy he truly was. And perhaps that was why these moments meant so much to him. Because Ada wasn't trying to impress Daniel Adebayo. She was simply sharing what she had with Daniel. And somehow, she was introducing a billionaire to a kind of happiness his money had never taught him how to buy. Ada and Daniel continued walking side by side beneath the Lagos evening lights. Cars passed beside them. People hurried along the roadside. The city was still noisy and busy. But somehow, Daniel barely noticed any of it. He and Ada ate their roasted corn, talking, teasing each other, and laughing like two people who had forgotten every problem, waiting for them tomorrow. Daniel looked at the piece of roasted corn in his hand and smiled. He had eaten in some of the finest restaurants in the world. He had attended private dinners prepared by famous chefs. He had spent ridiculous amounts of money on meals he could barely remember. Yet somehow, he couldn't remember enjoying any of them as much as this. Then Daniel looked at Ada. She was laughing beside him, completely relaxed, completely comfortable. and most importantly, happy. Daniel's smile slowly softened. Because somewhere between the crowded bus, the embarrassing fall, the roasted corn, and Ada's laughter, something had changed. This was no longer an experiment. Daniel was no longer pretending to be a security guard simply to understand Ada. He wanted these moments to continue. He wanted the laughter, the simple conversations, the quiet evenings inside her bakery. He wanted this version of life because it had Ada in it, and that realization frightened him. Because the deeper Daniel fell in love with her, the more dangerous his secret became. Every beautiful moment they shared was built around one painful truth. Ada still didn't know who he really was. And as they walked together beneath the Lagos lights, Daniel knew that sooner or later, the truth would come looking for them. The following morning, Ada arrived at the commercial complex as usual. She greeted a few familiar faces and began walking toward her bakery. But without even thinking about it, her eyes immediately moved toward the security post. The chair was empty. Ada slowed down. She looked toward the gate, then around the parking area. No Daniel. For a moment, a small look of disappointment crossed her face. But Ada quickly dismissed it. Why should it matter? Daniel was only the security guard, her friend, someone she enjoyed talking to. Nothing more. At least, that was what Ada kept telling herself. She entered the bakery and started her day. But a few minutes later, Ada found herself looking through the window. Still no Daniel. She returned to work, then looked again and again. Every time she heard someone outside, her eyes automatically moved toward the door, hoping it was him. That was when Ada began to realize something she wasn't quite ready to admit. Somewhere between the late-night conversations, the meat pie, the crowded bus, and the roasted corn, Daniel had quietly become part of her everyday life. And now that he wasn't there, she could feel his absence. Ada stared toward the empty security post one more time. She wasn't simply wondering where Daniel was anymore. She was missing him. Unfortunately for Ada, there was one person she couldn't fool. Her younger sister, Amaka. Amaka had been quietly watching Ada all morning. She noticed every glance toward the bakery window, every time Ada looked toward the security post, and especially the small box of cupcakes Ada was carefully arranging on the counter. Amaka leaned closer. Ada. Ada kept working. What? Amaka pointed toward the box. Who are those cupcakes for? Ada didn't even look up. A customer. Amaka smiled. A customer? Yes, Amaka. Customers buy cupcakes. That's generally how a bakery works. But Amaka wasn't convinced. She leaned against the counter and looked at her sister with a teasing smile. Interesting. Ada finally looked at her. What is interesting? Amaka nodded toward the window. I was just wondering which customer wears a navy blue security uniform. Ada froze. Her hand stopped in the middle of arranging the cupcakes. Slowly, she looked at Amaka. Amaka's smile grew wider. Ada quickly closed the box. Mind your business. Amaka's eyebrows went up. Oh, she started laughing. So there is business to mind. Amaka. Ada grabbed the cupcake box and walked away. But Amaka wasn't finished. She watched her sister leave and smiled to herself. Because Ada might have been able to lie to Daniel. She might even have been able to lie to herself. But she couldn't fool her little sister. Amaka already knew exactly what was happening. Ada was beginning to fall for the security guard. Amaka wasn't about to let the matter go. A few minutes later, she looked through the bakery window and spotted Daniel outside near the security post. Immediately, she pointed toward him. Ada, you like that security man? Ada almost dropped the tray in her hands. She turned around quickly. What? I do not. Amaka smiled. Oh, really? Yes, really. Amaka pointed toward the cupcake box. Then why are you making him cupcakes? Ada immediately became defensive. I make cupcakes for everybody. Amaka folded her arms. Everybody. Ada nodded. Everybody. Amaka tried not to laugh. Interesting. Because you've checked that gate about 7 times this morning. Ada stared at her. I was looking outside. For what? Ada opened her mouth, then stopped. She had no answer. Amaka's smile grew wider. Then she shook her head dramatically. Oh, my sister. Ada narrowed her eyes. Don't start. But Amaka was already laughing. My sister is in love. Amaka. Ada grabbed the tray and walked away, pretending to be annoyed. Go and find something useful to do. Amaka laughed behind her. But as Ada walked away, a small smile appeared on her face. She tried desperately to hide it. But she couldn't. Because perhaps Amaka was right. Perhaps somewhere between Daniel's terrible jokes, their quiet evenings, the crowded bus, And that simple roasted corn. Her heart had started feeling something again. Something Ada had promised herself she would be much more careful with. Love. By evening, Daniel still hadn't returned. As Ada prepared to close the bakery, she stepped outside and looked toward the security post one more time. The chair was still empty. For some reason, the entire place felt different without him. Ada stood there quietly, her eyes fixed on that empty chair. And slowly, memories began returning. She remembered Daniel's jokes, his completely useless attempt to repair her car. She remembered watching him struggle inside the crowded Lagos bus and laughing until her stomach hurt when he nearly fell on another passenger. She remembered the roasted corn they shared while walking beneath the city lights. But most of all, Ada remembered the quiet moments. The way Daniel listened when she spoke about her father. He hadn't interrupted her. He hadn't tried to impress her. He had simply stayed and listened. Ada lowered her eyes. Suddenly, Amaka's teasing words from earlier didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. Maybe her sister had noticed something Ada had been too afraid to admit. She missed him, and that realization frightened her. Because this wasn't Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire she was thinking about. It wasn't the famous businessman whose name had changed her attitude at the charity event. She didn't miss his money, his status, or the powerful name attached to him. She missed the man who sat on a plastic chair outside her bakery, the man who made her laugh, the man who listened, the man she had slowly learned to trust. Ada looked toward the empty security chair one final time, and for the first time, she admitted the truth to herself. She was falling in love with Daniel, the security guard, asterisk asterisk. And what Ada didn't know was that the man she had fallen for had never truly existed. But there was something Ada didn't know. Every evening, after Daniel finished his shift and said goodbye to everyone at the complex, he never went directly home. Instead, he walked several streets away from the bakery, far enough that nobody would recognize him, far enough that Ada would never see what happened next. And there, Daniel's real life was waiting for him. A sleek black luxury SUV pulled quietly beside the road. Daniel stopped. He looked behind him, then carefully checked the street. Nobody from the complex was around. His professional driver stepped out of the vehicle, walked around to the back, and opened the rear door. For a brief moment, Daniel hesitated. Then he climbed inside. The door closed behind him. And just like that, the ordinary security guard Ada knew disappeared. Nobody at the complex could know the truth. Mr. Bello knew only because Daniel needed his help. But everyone else had to believe the lie. Especially Ada, because every day, she trusted Daniel a little more. Every conversation brought them closer. Every smile made her lower another wall around her heart. And every night, when Daniel climbed back into that luxury SUV, the secret he was carrying became heavier. He had started this pretending to be a poor man, just so Ada could see the person behind his money. But now she was falling in love with that person. And Daniel was beginning to understand the terrible problem he had created. The closer Ada came to loving him, the closer Daniel came to breaking her heart. Asterisk asterisk. Inside the luxury SUV, Daniel leaned back against the leather seat and slowly removed his security jacket. Beside him was another set of clothes. An expensive, perfectly tailored business suit. The kind of suit the real Daniel Adebayo was known for wearing. Daniel looked down at the security uniform in his hands. Only minutes earlier, people had been calling him security. Drivers had been giving him orders. Ada had been speaking to him like an ordinary man trying to rebuild his life. But now, everything was changing again. Daniel removed the rest of the uniform and put on his expensive suit. He adjusted his shirt, fastened his watch, straightened his jacket, and within minutes, the security guard disappeared. Daniel Adebayo, the billionaire, was back. But Daniel didn't immediately tell his driver to move. Instead, he stared quietly at the security uniform lying beside him, then at the expensive suit covering his body. Two sets of clothes, two completely different lives. Yet underneath both was the same man. The problem was, Ada didn't know that. She was slowly falling for Daniel, the security guard, the man she believed had lost his fortune, the man she believed understood what it meant to struggle. Meanwhile, Daniel Adebayo still had his companies, his luxury cars, his enormous home, his millions. Everything he had told Ada he had lost was still waiting for him every night. Daniel looked out through the dark window. For the first time, his plan no longer felt clever. It felt dangerous, because he couldn't keep living two lives forever. Sooner or later, The billionaire and the security guard would have to become one man again. And when that happened, Daniel knew his two worlds would collide. The only question was, would Ada still love the man standing between them? Less than an hour later, Daniel stepped into the executive boardroom of Adebayo Holdings. And immediately, the atmosphere changed. The executives around the long conference table rose to their feet. "Good evening, Mr. Adebayo." Daniel gave a small nod and walked confidently toward the head of the table. There was no security uniform now, no plastic chair, no impatient drivers shouting at him from their cars. This was Daniel's world. Here, people waited for him before meetings could begin. They listened when he spoke. They wrote down his instructions. And decisions worth millions of naira could be made with nothing more than Daniel's signature. It was almost difficult to believe that only a few hours earlier, this same man had been standing beneath the Lagos sun, opening gates, directing traffic, and being treated like someone who didn't matter. Here, nobody threw car keys at Daniel. Nobody shouted security. Nobody looked through him as though he were invisible. Here, Daniel Adebayo was powerful. This was the life he had worked hard to build. The life thousands of people would gladly trade places with him to have. And yet, as Daniel settled into the expensive chair at the head of the table, something felt different. His mind wandered back to a little bakery, to Ada's laughter, their conversations after closing, the plastic chair beside the security post, a bottle of water, a meat pie, and roasted corn on a Lagos roadside. Daniel had returned to his world of wealth and power. But strangely, a part of him already wanted to go back to Ada's simple world. The meeting continued late into the night. Numbers, contracts, investments, and expansion plans worth millions filled the table. Normally, Daniel could handle meetings like this without difficulty. But tonight, his body was beginning to betray him. He rubbed his tired eyes and tried to concentrate on the documents in front of him. But exhaustion had finally caught up with him. By day, Daniel stood beneath the hot Lagos sun as a security guard, opening gates, directing cars, carrying boxes for Ada. Then, every evening, he secretly changed back into his expensive suit and returned to Adebayo Holdings. Security guard by day, billionaire CEO by night. And somewhere between those two lives, Daniel was barely finding time to rest. Across the table, Tund watched his friend struggling to keep his eyes open. He had warned Daniel that this plan was dangerous. But now, the problem wasn't only Daniel's exhaustion. Something much more serious was happening. Daniel was falling deeply in love with Ada. And Ada was beginning to fall in love with a man she didn't know was pretending. Eventually, the meeting ended. One by one, the executives gathered their documents and left the boardroom, until only two people remained, Daniel and Toby. Daniel leaned back tiredly in his chair, but Toby didn't move. He stood there quietly, watching his friend, because there was something Daniel needed to hear, something uncomfortable, something Daniel had been avoiding from the very beginning. And this time, Toby wasn't going to let him walk away from it. After the last executive left, Toby quietly walked over and closed the boardroom door. Daniel immediately knew something was wrong. Toby turned toward him. "Daniel, this has gone too far." Daniel looked away. He was too tired to argue. But Toby wasn't trying to fight with him. He was trying to protect his friend, and perhaps protect Ada too. "Ada isn't just getting to know you anymore," Toby said quietly. "She has feelings for you." Daniel remained silent. Toby stepped closer. "But the man she's falling in love with doesn't exist." Daniel's jaw tightened. "The feelings are real, Toby. I know your feelings are real." Toby paused. "But does Ada know what's real?" Daniel finally looked at him. Toby continued. "She thinks your family business collapsed. She thinks you lost everything. She thinks you stand at that gate every day because that's the only job you have." Daniel lowered his eyes. Every word was true. Toby's voice softened. "Daniel, what happens when she discovers that while she was opening her heart to you, you were going home every night in a luxury SUV?" Daniel had no answer. What happens when she discovers that the security guard she trusted was actually the billionaire she was afraid to trust in the first place? Silence filled the boardroom. Daniel looked down at the table. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about whether Ada would still love him. After discovering he was rich, he was thinking about whether she would forgive him for lying. Toby placed a hand gently on his friend's shoulder. "If you truly love her, tell her the truth." Daniel slowly looked up. Toby held his gaze. "Tell her yourself, before someone else does." Daniel said nothing, Because deep inside, he knew Toby was right. The truth was coming. And every day Daniel waited. He was giving that truth another reason to destroy them. A few days later, Daniel was standing at his usual position near the security gate when a luxury SUV drove into the complex. The vehicle stopped directly in front of Ada's bakery, blocking almost the entire entrance. Daniel waited for a moment, expecting the driver to move. But instead, a wealthy-looking businessman stepped out, locked the vehicle, and began walking away. Daniel quickly approached him. "Excuse me, sir." The man stopped and turned around. Daniel spoke politely. "Please, you'll need to move your vehicle. You're blocking the entrance to the bakery." The man slowly looked Daniel up and down. His eyes moved over the navy blue security uniform, then back to Daniel's face. And suddenly, he laughed. "Who are you to tell me where to park?" Daniel's expression remained calm. "I'm only doing my job, sir. Customers need access to the bakery." The man's smile disappeared. "So because you're wearing a security uniform, you think you can give me orders?" Daniel took a slow breath. He could feel his anger rising, but he refused to react. "I'm not giving you an order, sir. I'm simply asking you to move the vehicle." But the businessman wasn't interested in being reasonable. To him, Daniel wasn't a man deserving of respect. He was just a security guard, someone beneath him. The man stepped closer. Daniel stood his ground. Neither of them noticed that inside the bakery, Ada had already begun watching through the window. And within seconds, a simple request to move a car was about to become something much more serious. The businessman stepped even closer to Daniel. Daniel remained calm. "Sir, I'm only asking you to move your car." But instead of listening, the man suddenly shoved Daniel hard. Daniel stumbled backward. People nearby gasped and turned to look. For one dangerous second, Daniel's entire expression changed. His fists tightened. His jaw clenched. The man standing in front of him had absolutely no idea who he had just pushed. Daniel could have fought back. He could have revealed his identity right there. In fact, one phone call was all it would take. The arrogant businessman could be removed from the complex immediately, a complex Daniel secretly owned. But Daniel stopped himself. He looked down at the security uniform he was wearing, then slowly relaxed his fists. He wasn't going to use his wealth. He wasn't going to use his power. And he wasn't going to fight. The businessman noticed Daniel's restraint and mistook it for weakness. A smug smile appeared on his face. "What are you going to do about it?" Daniel stared at him silently. Then suddenly, a furious voice came from behind them. "Hey!" Everyone turned. Daniel looked toward the bakery. Ada was rushing outside, and from the expression on her face, she had seen everything. Daniel had chosen not to defend himself. But unfortunately for the arrogant businessman, Ada had other plans. Ada had seen everything through the bakery window. The argument, the insults, and finally, the moment the man pushed Daniel. That was enough. Ada dropped what she was doing and rushed out of the bakery. "What is wrong with you?" Her angry voice immediately caught everyone's attention. Daniel turned toward her in surprise. He had seen Ada passionate before. He had seen her argue over food being wasted. He had even seen her frustrated with difficult customers. But he had never seen her this angry. The businessman looked at Ada dismissively. "This doesn't concern you." Ada stopped directly in front of him. Her eyes narrowed. "Oh, it concerns me." Daniel watched in disbelief as Ada stepped between them. The businessman was clearly wealthy. His expensive clothes, his luxury SUV, everything about him announced his status. But Ada didn't care. She wasn't intimidated by his money. She wasn't impressed by his designer suit. And she certainly wasn't afraid of him. All Ada could see was a wealthy man who believed he had the right to humiliate someone simply because that person wore a security uniform. And she wasn't going to stand there and allow it. Daniel stared at her from behind. He had spent his entire life watching people become careful around wealthy and powerful men. But Ada? Ada stepped directly in front of one, just to defend a security guard. Ada stood firmly between Daniel and the wealthy businessman. She looked the man directly in the eyes and pointed at him. "You will never put your hands on him again." The businessman stared at her in disbelief. Then he looked past Ada toward Daniel and scoffed. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this? He's just a security guard." Ada's expression immediately hardened. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then she said firmly, "He's not just anything." The man frowned. Ada continued, "He's a human being, and he deserves the same respect you expect people to give you." The businessman tried to interrupt, but Ada wasn't finished. You having money doesn't make you better than him. Those words silenced everyone around them. But behind Ada, Daniel couldn't move. He simply stared at her. All his life, people had defended Daniel because of what he represented, because he was powerful, because he was wealthy, because the name Daniel Adebayo could open doors. People were careful around him because they knew what he could do. But Ada believed all of that was gone. She believed Daniel had lost his money, his influence, his powerful connections. As far as she knew, the man standing behind her had absolutely nothing to offer. And still, Ada had placed herself between him and someone more powerful. Not because Daniel was important, not because Daniel was rich, but simply because Daniel mattered to her. And standing behind Ada in that moment, the billionaire who had everything suddenly felt something money had never been able to give him. Someone was standing up for him when they believed he had nothing. After a few tense moments, the wealthy man finally got into his car and drove away. Ada didn't even watch him leave. She immediately turned toward Daniel. Her anger disappeared, replaced by genuine concern. "Daniel, are you okay?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply stared at her. Ada stepped closer and gently touched his arm. "Daniel." Still, he said nothing, because at that moment, Daniel wasn't thinking about the man who had pushed him. He was thinking about Ada. This woman had just stood between him and a wealthy stranger. Without hesitation, she believed Daniel had lost everything. She believed his companies were gone. His money was gone. His powerful connections were gone. As far as Ada knew, Daniel was simply a security guard trying to rebuild his life. A man who could offer her no expensive lifestyle, no luxury cars, no powerful connections, nothing but himself. And still, she cared about him. She defended him. She was worried about him. Daniel looked into her eyes. And suddenly, everything became clear. This wasn't curiosity anymore. This wasn't about proving whether Ada could love a man without money. And it certainly wasn't an experiment anymore. Somewhere between the rainy nights, the quiet conversations, the meat pie, the crowded bus, the roasted corn, in this moment, Daniel had fallen completely in love with her. Not because Ada treated him like a billionaire, but because she treated him like a human being. When she believed he was nobody important, Daniel finally understood what his heart had been trying to tell him. He loved Ada, completely. And instead of making him happy, that realization terrified him. Because the woman he loved valued honesty and trust more than money. And Daniel had won her heart. With a lie. One quiet evening after the bakery had closed, Ada and Daniel were sitting together, enjoying the peaceful silence that had slowly become part of their routine. Then Ada reached beneath the counter and brought out a small, old box. Daniel watched curiously as she placed it carefully on the table. There was something about the way Ada held the box, as though whatever was inside meant more to her than anyone could understand. Slowly, she opened it. Inside was a necklace. It wasn't made of expensive diamonds. It wasn't the kind of jewelry Daniel normally saw at glamorous events. In fact, to anyone else, it might have looked ordinary. But Ada lifted it from the box with such care that Daniel immediately knew it was priceless to her. He smiled gently. "What's so special about this necklace?" For a moment, Ada didn't answer. She simply stared at it in her hand. Then her expression changed. Her smile faded, and her eyes became emotional. Finally, she looked at Daniel and said softly, "It belonged to my mother." Daniel's smile slowly disappeared. Suddenly, he understood. This wasn't just an old necklace. It was a memory, a connection to someone Ada could no longer hold. And as Daniel watched the way she gently held it in her palm, he knew he was about to hear another piece of Ada's heart, one she didn't share with just anyone. Ada gently placed the necklace in the palm of her hand. For a few seconds, she simply looked at it. Then a small, emotional smile appeared on her face. "My mother gave this to me before she died." Daniel remained quiet. He could hear the emotion in Ada's voice, but he could also see something else. Love. This necklace reminded Ada not only of what she had lost, but of the woman who had helped shape the person she had become. Ada gently ran her fingers across it. "My mother wasn't a woman who cared much about expensive things." She smiled. "Whenever life became difficult, she would always tell me something." Daniel listened carefully. Ada looked down at the necklace. She said, "Ada, one day you might lose money. You might lose possessions. Sometimes, you might even lose people you love." Ada paused. Then she continued softly, "But no matter what life takes away from you, never lose yourself." Daniel's expression softened. Suddenly, so much about Ada made sense. Why money didn't impress her. Why she valued kindness. Why she would rather walk away from wealth than remain somewhere she wasn't respected. Ada closed her fingers gently around the necklace. To anyone else, it was simply an old piece of jewelry. But to Ada, it was her mother's voice, her mother's wisdom, a reminder of where she came from, and the kind of woman she wanted to remain. Daniel looked at the necklace, then at Ada. He had spent his life surrounded by things worth millions. But sitting beside her that evening, he understood something. Some things could never be measured by their price, and this necklace was one of them. Ada gently held the necklace against her chest. For a moment, she became quiet. Then a soft smile appeared on her face. She looked at Daniel. You know something, Daniel? Daniel smiled. What? Ada glanced down at the necklace before looking back into his eyes. Then she said softly, some things are worth more than money. Daniel's smile remained. But something about those words caught his attention. Ada continued, money can disappear. You can lose a house, a car, even everything you've worked for. She paused. But when somebody gives you their trust, their loyalty, and their love, those things are different. Daniel became unusually quiet. Ada looked directly into his eyes. When someone gives you those things genuinely, you protect them. The smile on Daniel's face slowly disappeared, because Ada had no idea what her words were doing to him. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She didn't know about the luxury SUV that collected him every night. She didn't know about the expensive suits hidden inside it. And she certainly didn't know that the security guard sitting beside her was still the billionaire she believed had lost everything. Yet without knowing it, Ada had just named the three things Daniel was now most afraid of losing. Her trust, her loyalty, and perhaps her love. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time, the lie that had brought them together no longer felt clever. It felt like a ticking clock, because Ada had just told him exactly what mattered most to her. And Daniel knew he was already putting all of it at risk. Ada continued holding the necklace gently in her hand. Then she looked directly into Daniel's eyes. Her expression became serious. You know, Daniel, I can forgive many things. Daniel listened quietly. Ada paused for a moment. But betrayal? She slowly shook her head. That's different. Daniel's expression changed slightly. Ada continued. When I trust someone, I don't do it halfway. I give that person a part of myself. She looked down at the necklace, then back at him. So when someone takes that trust and makes me feel foolish for giving it to them. Ada paused. I don't know if I can ever look at that person the same way again. Daniel's stomach tightened. Suddenly, the quiet bakery felt uncomfortable. Ada wasn't accusing him. She wasn't suspicious. She had absolutely no idea that Daniel was hiding anything from her. But every word felt as though it had been spoken directly to his conscience. Daniel looked away. He thought about the story he had invented, the business that had supposedly collapsed, the fortune he claimed to have lost, the security job Ada believed was his only source of income. And every night, the luxury SUV waiting several streets away. Daniel had started with one lie, but that one lie had grown into an entire life. He looked back at Ada. She trusted him now, perhaps more than she had trusted any man since Kelvin. And suddenly, Daniel wanted to tell her everything. No more pretending, no more hiding. He needed to tell her the truth. Because for the first time, Daniel understood that he wasn't simply risking Ada's love. He was risking something even harder to recover, her trust. And as Ada smiled innocently at him, one frightening thought entered Daniel's mind. Perhaps he hadn't waited too long yet. But if he remained silent much longer, he would. Daniel sat quietly for a moment. But Ada's words about trust wouldn't leave his mind. Finally, he looked at her. Ada. She turned toward him. Yes. Daniel opened his mouth, then hesitated. His heart began beating faster. This was it. No more lies. No more pretending. Tell her about Adebayo Holdings. Tell her the business never collapsed. Tell her he never lost his fortune. Tell her that every evening, after leaving the security post, a luxury SUV waited several streets away to take him back to his real life. Tell her that the security uniform, the story about losing everything, all of it had begun as a plan to make her see the man behind his money. Just tell her the truth, before someone else does. Daniel took a deep breath. Ada, there's something I need to tell you. Ada looked at him curiously. Okay, I'm listening. Daniel stared into her eyes. The eyes of the woman who had trusted him with the story of her father. The woman who had defended him when she believed he was only a security guard. The woman who had just told him that betrayal was the one thing she struggled to forgive. And suddenly, Daniel became afraid. What if the truth made her hate him? What if she walked away? Just like she had walked away from Kelvin? Daniel's courage disappeared. He forced a small smile. Never mind. Ada looked confused. Are you sure? Daniel nodded. Yeah, it's nothing. Ada smiled innocently. Okay. But Daniel knew. It wasn't okay. Because every second he remained silent, the truth became more dangerous. Every smile from Ada made the lie heavier. Every moment of trust gave Daniel more to lose. And what Daniel didn't know was that he was running out of time. Very soon, Ada would discover that the struggling security guard she was falling in love with had never lost his fortune, that the man opening gates beneath the Lagos sun was still a billionaire. And when that truth finally came out, Daniel wouldn't only have to explain why he lied. He would have to face the one question he feared most. Would Ada believe that his love was real when the man she fell in love with was built on a lie? And worse, what if Ada discovered the truth from someone else before Daniel could confess? To be continued. In part 2, Daniel's secret can no longer stay hidden. And when Ada finally discovers who the security guard really is, the love Daniel risked everything to find may become the very thing he loses. Thanks for watching. Kindly subscribe and hit the notification button.